At the start of the year, Alberta finds itself in a relatively strong economic position, partially thanks to our roaring population growth, renewed vitality in the resources sector, a stronger labor market, and strong residential and capital investment. And Alberta is once again forecasted to be a leader in growth for Canada. But as the global economy is expected to slow down and the national economy, sputters, we see the provincial economy softening as well. And Alberta may very well feel the impacts of a potential recession. Well, hey there. You're listening to the Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. I'm Brittany Brander, and in this series, my co-host, Scott Crockett, and I explore Alberta's big challenges, celebrate stories of growth, innovation, and prosperity, and discover bold ideas to make life better for Albertans. On today's episode, we're back with BCA's economics team, Mike Holden and Alicia Planincic, to break down the winter 2024 update of the Alberta Snapshot, an all-point summary of Alberta's economy. And we'll look at things like labor market and employment, we'll check up on consumer spending and affordability, and discuss business expectations in the state of the economy. We'll also look ahead at some indicators that you should be watching out for. If you found this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and give us a quick review and a rating. Now, onto the show. Well, hey there, and welcome back to another episode of The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. And we are back with our esteemed economists, Mike Holden and Alicia Planincic, to talk about what has happened in Alberta and Canada's economy since our last update in October of 2023. Welcome back, friends.
Thank you.
Always a good time.
So we're recording this in the first few weeks of 2024, and let's take a look back at how 2023 rounded out since our last update. What is the current state of the economy right now, both in Alberta and nationally? And second parter to that question, how would you ultimately rank 2023 in terms of growth and prosperity for Albertans over like the last 10 years or so?
Let's start with 2023 and how it rounded out. I think that, we were expecting to see the economy nationally and provincially slow through 2023. We saw interest rates rise through the back end of 2022 and into last year. And then, we were kind of waiting to see when that would have an impact, because rising interest rates don't necessarily cause the economy to slow right away. It takes between 12 and 18 months for that to happen. And, we were kind of waiting through the year to see if and when that would take place. And it started to happen towards the end of the year. So, in general, we saw slowing economic growth. Alberta did better than the national average by a fair bit last year. But, we're not immune here in the province. And so we're starting to see that economic activity slowly taper off.
Great. Well, let's talk about the part of the economy that most people care the most about, I would argue, and that's their job. So when we last recorded a Snapshot podcast, it was back in October of 2023, and we just experienced what I might call the flash crash in our sort of jobs numbers. We saw this huge decline of more than 37,000 jobs in September, and then we saw those jobs come kind of roaring back in October. And so I think you predicted correctly that was a little bit of a blip, but something different has happened since then. What have we seen since that point?
Well, we've seen, as I said before, we're starting to see a little bit slower economic growth. That was a weird month. September, like you said, lost 38,000 jobs, which clearly there was nothing in the province that happened in order to see those kinds of large numbers. And so, we said at the time that it was probably statistical error, and that's where we are now.
Unpack that just like a tiny bit more. What kind of an error causes this to happen, after decades of looking at jobs numbers?
Well, all these jobs numbers are based on surveys, right? And so, it's the whole confidence interval thing. What is it, 95%, 19 times
This
out of 20?
This is another way of saying we don't know for sure and perhaps never will, and never buy too much into any single month of the labor force survey.
And that's something we've always said. It's always been like, don't overreact positively or negatively to any one month. And that was the perfect example of why you don't do that.
Yeah, a near perfect example. But sorry, continue. Since then, though?
Since then, we've seen employment growth has continued in the province. It's slowed down since then. And right now, we're at the point with the last couple of months, November, December is the data we've got available now. And we've seen the number of jobs grow at about the same pace as the Alberta population. So, the employment rate, which is simply the, percentage of people of working age who have a job, that's been pretty flat for the last 3 months since then. We've seen a bit of a creep up in the number of Albertans who are actively looking for work. And so because of that, we're starting to see the unemployment rate creep up as the year came to a close.
One of the other things that we talk about when we talk about labor market is job vacancies. And I mean, Alberta had like a lot of job vacancies for a long, like it was a hot labor market. I mean, sitting here last year, we were talking about how Alberta's labor market was white hot, but it's just not the case this year. So what is going on in terms of the number of jobs that are even available?
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the biggest tells of a labor market that is cooling in Alberta is the fact that job vacancies have declined pretty sharply. We've seen a decrease in the job vacancy rate, so the percentage of total jobs that are just sitting open looking for somebody to fill them, from 5% at its peak down to 4% more recently. And basically what we're hearing from businesses is they're starting to get a little bit more cautious when they look to 2024 in terms of hiring. So they're not necessarily making layoffs, but they're rethinking those open positions that they have out. Now, I will put this what I call a sharp decline in perspective, in that we're still at the highest rate that we've seen historically, other than at the most recent peak. So the labor market is certainly still tight, and geographically, so when we look versus other provinces, Alberta actually now has a higher job vacancy rate than the national average. So whereas we saw a sharp decline, the national average actually really collapsed over this time.
So I think it's interesting to talk about job vacancies as a kind of barometer for the economy. And to help myself get my head around this, I tried to imagine like help wanted signs in store windows as a way to kind of think about it. I don't know if you think that is a good way to look at it or not.
Oh, that's a great way to think about it. And I think too, as the economy slows down and as businesses cools, that's one of the first things that businesses will cut. So instead of cutting their staffing, right, which I think businesses are quite hesitant to do, especially after they realize post-pandemic just how difficult it can be to restaff, instead they take down those help wanted signs. Exactly.
So I guess at this moment in time, what we're saying is that there are fewer help wanted signs. We've seen a decline in the number of businesses with help wanted signs in the window. However, Alberta still has the most help wanted signs in the windows in Canada. So talk about which industries are sort of driving that at the moment.
Well, what we saw last year was a really good year for the resource sector. And that's been the main jobs driver in Alberta for last year. So we gained about 17,000 jobs in the sector, which was, and employment growth there had been relatively weak in time past. By contrast, the exact opposite was true of professional services, which had previously been driving employment growth in Alberta, and that had a weaker year in 2023. In terms of the job vacancy rate, though, I think there are three main areas where we see high vacancy rates, and that's been persistent for the last little while. The first one is construction. And that's above the provincial average, and that's been higher in the last 6 months than it was in the first half of the year. So that's a problem that's not going away. It's a bit higher in transportation and logistics than it is elsewhere. But the big one really is hospitality industries, and that's where we see, and that's been the case since COVID, and businesses in those areas are really having a hard time finding people to fill those positions. And so that's where we see the most acute shortages.
Do you have any color commentary on what you attribute that to in the hospitality sector?
Well, just kind of some historical perspective, I would say this is one that's always had really high level of job vacancies. So I think it's not too surprising that as most all industries saw an increase in job vacancies, so did food and hospitality, and it kind of was already in the lead, so kind of continued to be in the lead. But I will say, yeah, construction's one that's definitely popped to the top in Alberta and has really stayed in that number 2 position.
Yeah, and I recently had dinner with a few construction companies, actually, and this was the first thing that came up. Obviously, was the difficulty in filling certain positions, especially certain types of skilled trades. It seems to be, I would say, a Canada-wide at least problem, and probably many industrialized democracies as well.
Yeah, and I mean, just by pure anecdote, in a similar fashion, I know of some companies or some people who are, working on specific construction sites where they will have, for example, a number of carpenters and people working for them on specific sites. And even if the work is slowing down on a specific job site, they tend to keep people around, even if they're underusing them, because they don't want to lose them for when work picks back up again.
Right, and we've got a number of really major super projects in Western Canada that are beginning to finish construction, but there are quite a handful sort of in the pipeline, kind of coming along, certainly carbon capture pipelines for one thing, and the large Dow facility, a number of others too.
Let's talk a little bit about what the average everyday Albertan is feeling in terms of their own household budget, their own pocketbook. Let's start with wages. This has actually been kind of a feel-good story over the last few months. What are you seeing in terms of wage growth, improving living standards?
Yeah, so what we looked at with this recent report is something called real wages, which basically means, are your dollars actually purchasing more? So the dollars that you bring home from work, are you actually able to get more out of that? And so that's basically looking at two things, both how much you're making from your job and also how much our price is changing. And so what we've seen in the bad news story that we've been talking about for quite a while now is the fact that prices have been increasing more than wages. And the good news story this time is that we've actually seen for a few months now that is no longer the case. So wages are actually starting to increase more in Alberta. This is something that was not happening in Alberta as it was elsewhere, and inflation has actually backed off. Of course, that being more of a national story, but overall that leaves Albertans in a little bit better place. A little bit of cold water on that though, unfortunately. One is
You're always such a ray of sunshine.
I know.
We all are. It's our job.
That's our job as economists. I think that we'll probably stall out here as the labor market and global economy cools. I don't think we can expect to see too much higher wage growth among Albertans. And the inflation story, I think, is going to get a little bit dicey from here too, where I think it's going to get harder and harder to see price growth decrease from here.
How are prices, interest rates, wages impacting consumer spending right now?
It's interesting, actually, because there's the two things happening at the same time here. One is that so much of the economic activity that's happening in Alberta, across Canada, but especially in Alberta, is really being driven by population growth. And so what we're seeing on the sort of aggregate level, so if you add up all the spending that's happening in the province, it's remained pretty solid. And so we've seen, we're not seeing a lot of growth, but it's certainly not falling on a sort of a total amount of money being spent.
Total amount spent kind of basis, not a per person spending basis.
That's where the difference comes in, is that
the malls are busy. I can tell you that.
Can confirm, actually, yes.
No parking spots.
I've been in both Calgary and Edmonton recently, and at least the malls in both those places are doing fine.
Yeah, but the people who are going to the malls aren't necessarily spending as much as they used to. And so that's what we're seeing on a per person basis. Consumer spending in Alberta, it's still higher than it is in other provinces, but it is coming down. And we're seeing some changes in what people are spending their money on as well. And so they're spending it more focusing on basic necessities, on food, clothing, personal care, health products, those kinds of things.
Right.
And we're seeing less spending in a couple of areas. One is gasoline, and that's just a price effect issue. We're seeing oil prices and gasoline prices are much lower now than they were at the same time last year, so there's a decline there. And then the other is really big ticket items. And so where people aren't buying as much furniture, they're not going to hardware stores, they're not renovating their kitchens, they're not spending money on things that aren't really necessary in the moment.
As we sit here recording this, the holiday credit card bills are almost exactly coming due at this moment.
We just had Blue Monday a week ago.
Yeah. For Albertans and Canadians, how do you think people are feeling in terms of their level of financial strain? Has it worsened? Has it gotten better? And how are Albertans relative to the Canadian average?
Yeah, such a good question. I think one that all economists are asking and really looking for, especially as interest rates increase. So those bills are becoming more expensive to pay back your credit card debt for your mortgage, etc. And so a couple of the indicators that we've been looking at, one is insolvencies data. And we have seen an increase in insolvencies among Albertans, but also Canada-wide. Now, the good news here, though, is that they have not been translating into bankruptcy too much, at least not yet. So for now, people are probably finding it hard to pay their bills, but they're making it work. The other thing that we haven't seen yet is a huge increase in what we call mortgages in arrears, which is a weird word for saying that people are late on their mortgage
payments.
Behind
on their mortgage, yeah.
Exactly. So far, we're seeing strain, but it's not so much that it's really becoming an aggregate problem.
So we haven't quite felt the full weight of interest rates yet on both businesses and consumers. What do you expect to happen over the next 6, 8, 12 months as we see the impact of those interest rates on individuals and businesses?
Well, I think we're kind of in a wait and see point in a way. So we've the most recent inflation numbers that came up were a little bit higher than people had expected. And, we've seen a lot of rate increases. We see a lot of evidence that the Canadian economy is slowing down. And I think that there was an expectation or a hope that we could start to see interest rates fall as early as the first quarter or first half of 2024. And I think that, as Lish said earlier, we've got, based on the inflation numbers that we've seen recently, and that the sort of the hard work of getting inflation down from that kind of 3.4% range where it's at now, into or closer to 2%, which is where the Bank of Canada would like it to be, that's going to be more difficult to do. And so I think that, there's a hope that we're going to see interest rates fall at some point in 2024. I think if that is to be the case, it's probably not going to happen until the second half of the year.
It's not happening Wednesday.
It is not happening Wednesday.
The day after we release this. Well, let me ask you a couple of the more controversial questions about that then. One of them would be, do you think, in your opinion, is the Bank of Canada correct to pursue this pretty aggressive strategy of saying we really want to get down to that 2% target and we're going to keep interest rates high until we get there?
Ooh, that is a big, hardy question. Yeah, and in fact, I kind of remember even the governor of Bank of Canada himself saying that, when the mandate comes due, I can't remember, in a couple of years, that they'll be basically asking themselves that question. Mm-hmm. So, and it's kind of unusual, I think, to hear that come out of somebody who's one and only goal, right? It is to maintain inflation at that level. But yeah, I think that's the question that we'll have to ask ourselves, especially as, we have an aging population and some deglobalization trends. And so these other factors weighing on price growth longer term, it might be a question worth asking.
And I think actually that there is an excellent point. I think that some of the deglobalization trends, some of the climate policies that will potentially increase prices for things that people are higher fuel costs, that it's going to be more expensive to start shipping things across oceans, higher electricity prices potentially. I mean, there's a million things that can happen, but I think that in most cases, the cost pressures that we can expect are on the positive side in terms of higher prices than they are on the negative side. And that just means that it's going to make the Bank of Canada and other central banks, it's going to make their job a lot more difficult.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree with you. Question worth asking because, some people point out that Canada's got one of, if not the most aggressive sort of monetary policy in the G7 over the course of this period. So I think it's something, that we're going to have to ask, is this what we want to do going forward, especially because where most people interact with our interest rates has to do with their own mortgage. So let's talk about housing for a moment. Alberta's seeing absolutely record numbers of people moving here, injecting lots of energy and optimism into the economy. What's happening with housing?
Yeah, I mean, the obvious thing that's happening with housing is prices are going up, and we're seeing this in mostly in Calgary. It's very strong price increases in Calgary, but also in Edmonton as well. And I think there's a little bit of evidence, or data isn't as good, that rural areas are having issues too. Just when you look at rental vacancies in rural Alberta, I've seen some recent statistics coming from Government of Alberta saying some places have exactly 0 rental vacancies.
I heard people counting the number of apartments, saying we've got one vacant or 3.
Which tells me a little bit about what's happening with prices. The one good thing that we're seeing in Alberta that has leveled out elsewhere is we are still seeing investment pour into residential construction. So I think that is a really good thing to see and to continue to see even as interest rates are high. We're not seeing the housing market respond to population growth in the way that we need it to. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately.
Say a little bit more about that. So I guess you're saying there are more people moving here than houses we're building.
Thank you.
We're just not building houses fast enough, considering.
And why is that?
Oh, there's a whole range of issues ranging from, residential delays in residential permitting, some of the labor shortages in construction, which we talked about earlier. So if construction companies can't find the skilled tradespeople that they need in order to build the places, we saw supply chain issues were a problem in the past. That's a little bit less so now, but to the extent that was a problem, if you can't get the material and you don't find the workers, you can't just magically accelerate housing construction, because if you don't have the people to do it, then how would you?
I think that's absolutely true, and I think that's super important longer term. I will just underscore that I think there's a really important thing to highlight on the demand side, where the population growth that we've seen is just honestly almost unheard of. I saw a chart that I almost fell off my chair looking at population growth average for the OECD versus Canada versus Alberta. OECD average population growth 0.6%. Canada, 3.2%. This is over the last year-ish of data. Okay. Alberta, 4.3%.
Wow. So just a multiple of the OECD average.
For sure.
That's crazy. How are Alberta businesses right now feeling about the state of things?
Well, that's actually a really interesting question. It's one of the areas where what we've seen and what we hear from businesses has really changed over the last year or so. So, rewind a year and a half, and they had two main issues. One, which I actually just alluded to earlier. So one of them was supply chain, inability to get materials, and the second one was labor shortages. And so basically, to sum it all up, they were worried about their inability to meet demand. And now, with slowing economy and supply chain issues having been resolved to some degree, now the concern is really about the demand itself. Is there enough demand out there?
Right.
And so that's going to depend, obviously, on the type of business that you're in. I mean, ones that, if you're in the housing market, you're not going to be worried too much about demand, for example. But, but in others you are. And so, we're seeing slower economic growth in Canada and around the world. We're seeing supply chain issues diminish. We're seeing excess capacity, for just to use the economic terms that Alicia's trying to avoid here. So that's what it is. So basically, in a nutshell, is what I said. It's instead of worrying about how you're going to meet demand, now you're worrying about, will there be enough demand?
Right. And what about just average everyday Albertans? I saw in the report that many still believe the economy is actually getting worse. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really good window into what I suspect Albertans are already feeling in their finances. And it kind of goes back to what we talked to earlier of, even though we're not seeing bankruptcies go up in a crazy way, we are still seeing the insolvencies. And I think people are feeling it in their pocketbooks. And so I think that's really reflected in the mood across Alberta.
Right. What's your general sense as far as national global economy goes? Where are we headed?
I think, we're in a slowing period. I think there's no way around that. If you look at some of the recent global projections that, if they compare what economists around the world are expecting in November versus what they expected in September or a few months earlier, that we're seeing growth rates being cut, or expectations of growth being cut. And so I think, and a lot of that has to do with rising interest rates around the world. It's not just Canada that's fighting with inflation. So the economies are slowing. And so I think that's happening around the world. It's definitely happening in Canada, and it's happening in Alberta. We're not immune to these forces. I mean, we have a lot of good things happening in the province. We have a lot of new investments and construction projects that'll be starting up next year, but we're not immune to those national and international forces.
How would you sum up the theme of this quarter's report?
Where I see the quarter going for Alberta, I think that, like I said, Canada's slowing. Alberta's in a relatively good position. We are the fastest skater on a slow team.
Okay, now comes that fun time when we force you two to make predictions whether you want to or not. And so
we'll see about that.
I'm going to start with the first one that you came very close to saying there. You said slowing period several times. You avoided a certain word, which was recession. How would you pin the likelihood of seeing a Canadian recession this year? Where are you at on that?
I think it's pretty high, actually. I mean, over the last two quarters, I'm not sure if the most recent Q4 numbers come out. I mean, they've been down. We're basically teetering on a technical recession right now anyway. If you look at per capita GDP growth, we've been down since 2018. There's some weakness there. And so I think that whether it's severe or whether it's soft and modest, I think it's highly likely.
That seems to make sense. Next lightning round. By the time we sit down for our next quarter, interest rates up, down, or the same?
Same.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Oil prices?
Up. This is a total guess for me every single time, for the
Oil
record.
Prices, I'm not sure if I've used this line before, but economists are almost always wrong about predicting oil prices. This is one of those areas where if you want to make an economist look foolish, you ask them where oil prices are going to go in a short period of time, or where the exchange rate's going to go. And those are two areas where you're just going to get us in trouble.
In the first half, down in the second half of the year is the expectations I've seen.
Yeah, certainly. And some of our special advisors look a little bit more closely at this. I think in the short run, it's hard to see anything geopolitically that would make prices go down. The risk factors seem to be way, way more weighted to the upside. How about home prices in Alberta? I mean, I know the answer to this one. This is in our famous "you don't have to be an economist to know" section.
It definitely is.
I do think Edmonton will start to level out, but Calgary definitely still up.
Yep, I agree.
Okay, what's the indicator to watch for the next 3 months?
Mine is the employment rate. I mean, there's a bunch you could pick. It's hard to choose, really. I mean, inflation and interest rates are going to be the most important ones, I think. Other fun ones that I'll be watching longer term are what Lish said before with mortgages and arrears. But for me, in the short term, it's employment rate, because we've seen this population growth in Alberta and across Canada. And the question is, can our economy keep pace and create jobs at the rate needed in order to keep that ratio of people employed?
Yeah, that's a good one to look at. I think we're used to seeing headlines around unemployment rates, but I think what you're saying is like the employment rate, especially during a period of this much population growth, is going to be more interesting to watch, because we have so many new people moving. Can the economy keep up with that pace to keep the same number of folks employed?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of employment rate. It's not an indicator that gets a lot of attention. We always talk about the unemployment rate, but the problem is that the unemployment rate can go up and down because of a couple of different factors. It could be because somebody lost their job, or it could be because somebody gave up looking for work. And then the question is, why do they give up looking for work?
Frustrated.
You're really failing this lightning round, just so you know.
I know. This is how I roll.
What's your indicator?
Okay, I'm gonna also cheat. It's called the beverage curve, and it's the relationship between unemployment and job vacancies. So my hope is that we'll continue to see job vacancies fall, but unemployment will really level out, and that's kind of the quintessential soft landing.
I love that it's called the beverage curve. It's not spelled like beverage, but it sounds like beverage,
right?
And it just makes me think of like iced tea. Like, oh, this is kind of nice,
yeah,
and refreshing.
Yeah. Curves are nice and refreshing when they're in the right direction and tell you what you want.
Also, my favorite index is the Big Mac index. Just sounds so delicious.
Yeah, that's a solid one.
I'm also going to say that for you calling me out in my long lightning round, that was
and then having a curve that also
better.
Cheated. Fair enough.
Final thought from each of you on this quarter's economic snapshot.
We're seeing what we thought was going to happen a year ago, which was gradually slowing economy nationally and provincially. The one thing that complicated that is that the magnitude of population growth that we've seen has been a bit of a surprise. Well, if you had asked us 2 years ago or a year and a half ago whether the Alberta population was going to grow at 4.3%, we would not have said yes. But here we are. And so that's been I think that's been either masking or alleviating some of the negative pressures, depending on how you want to look at it.
Mm-hmm. Alicia, final thought?
Totally agree with Mike. I mean, I think the one upside, and I think we talked about this a little bit, is capital investment, especially with these big projects coming online. And so I think we'll know more by the next time we meet, both in terms of the official reported StatsCan data, but also kind of where we stand on some of these bigger projects. And so kind of a little bit of upside that I'll be looking into.
Yeah,
Great.
Get some shovels in the ground.
Exactly.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining this episode of The Brief, and we will see you in 3 months for another update on Alberta's economy.
Sounds good.
Dun, dun.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta, and you can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. And we'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, and YouTube. And finally, don't forget to subscribe and rate the show and give us a quick review. Your support helps us to keep making more of these episodes. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.